Moving right along, I would like to invite Professor Gilley from the Mount Hatfield School of Government, College of Urban and Public Affairs, Portland State University, to come to stage and talk about the role of ASEAN in the growing conflict between China and the US in the South China Sea. About our speaker, so Dr. Gilley is a professor of political science at Portland State University. He obtained his PhD from Princeton University and his master degrees from Oxford University. His work on security in China has centered primarily on the role of middle powers, such as South Korea, Australia, Indonesia, and Vietnam, as well as Thailand. He is a specialist in the domestic politics of China, as well as the politics and security of Taiwan. He is a frequent participant in Track 1 discussions within the US government on Taiwan and China security issues. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Gilley.
Well, thanks for having me. It's an honor to share a stage with Professor Ness. Really just an amazing career of scholarship and development in Southeast Asia and Asia. So all of us young scholars should wish we could be half as productive as Professor Ness has been in his career. It's a real honor to be here and share some thoughts with you about South China Sea conflict. I was asked by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation to address the role of ASEAN in the growing US-China conflict in the South China Sea. And as you can see, I changed the title of my talk because I don't think there is a US-China conflict in the South China Sea. And I'm going to argue today that it is a time for choosing for ASEAN, that the United States is moving its security focus away from the South China Sea to other issues, and it is time for ASEAN to decide whether it wants to concede security of South China Sea and Southeast Asia generally to China or to find an alternative route. So the main points I'll make today are 5. First of all, I'm going to argue that the United States is withdrawing from leadership in the South China Sea and withdrawing from leadership in Southeast Asia more generally. The United States has higher priorities, and the Trump administration has signaled a fundamental change in the US willingness to underwrite global public goods for countries and regions that do not contribute their fair share. Secondly, I will argue, as I mentioned, that South China Sea issue is now an Indo-Pacific versus China conflict, not a US versus China conflict. Thirdly, because I do specialize in the politics of China, I will talk about the ways in which China's elite politics is currently in a period of significant instability and risk. And the result of that is China is more prone to external aggression in the South China Sea and Southeast Asia more generally. And that will particularly be the case during the 2022-2023 political transition in China. Fourthly, I will say that hopes for ASEAN to have a unified strategy on China in the South China Sea are fruitless. ASEAN will never have a unified strategy on China in the South China Sea, and therefore we need to think about alternatives to a unified strategy for ASEAN if ASEAN believes it does not want to concede control of the region to China. And finally, I will make an argument that one possible choice for ASEAN in the South China Sea is to think of itself as maintaining mutual support for individual deterrence initiatives, whether those are bilateral initiatives among ASEAN countries, bilateral initiatives between ASEAN countries and non-ASEAN countries, or the development of ad hoc joint security initiatives within or outside of ASEAN. So let me start with this key point, which is probably probably the most controversial I'm going to make, which is the United States is withdrawing from a leadership role in the South China Sea. Several things have been going on in the United States that began with the election of President Trump, but I would say preceded the election of President Trump. I think the Obama administration was a brief moment of attempted U.S. leadership in the South China Sea, mainly, I think, because our Secretary of State at the time was considering a presidential run and wanted to burnish her diplomatic record. But I think that was an anomaly. I think the long-term trend is that the United States has been slowly shifting away from leadership in the South China Sea area. One reason for this is the Trump administration has signaled a fundamental sea change in U.S. security strategy, in which it views regions who do not contribute their fair share to collective security as not deserving of U.S. support. We've seen that in the United States policy towards our NATO allies in Europe, frontline states with Russia. We've seen that in the U.S. decision to withdraw from Syria on the view that European countries in particular have failed to take the necessary leadership role there. And we are now seeing that in the South China Sea. Last year, the former U.S. Pacific Command was renamed as the Indo-Pacific Command. That is now one of 12 combat area commands in the U.S. military. And this includes the 7th Fleet, which is the primary naval assets in the Indo-Pacific Command, but of course it includes others. And I think this renaming from Pacific Command to Indo-Pacific Command is significant. The term Indo was actually first used by Japan when Japan was thinking about a broader pan-Pacific and pan-Indian Ocean security strategy that would bring together what we call the quadrilateral cooperation powers, Japan, the United States, Australia, and India, into a 4-part arrangement that would focus on the shared values of democracy in structuring security cooperation, not just in the Pacific, but in the Indian Ocean as well. And the revival of quadrilateral cooperation in 2017, United States, Japan, Australia, India, was the beginning of the United States' decision to rename its Pacific Command into the Indo-Pacific Command. What does this mean? First of all, it means that the U.S. command in this region takes seriously China's expansion efforts in the Indian Ocean, indeed views those expansion efforts perhaps as more serious than it views China's expansion efforts in the South China Sea. This would include Chinese expansion into the Maldives, Sri Lanka, Djibouti, and of course Belt Road initiatives throughout the Indian Ocean through down to East Africa. The Indo-Pacific Command also recognized the importance of containing Iran in the Indian Ocean on the view that of all the most likely major conflicts the United States will face in the next 10 years, a conflict with Iran is probably the highest on the list and therefore the highest priority for U.S. security strategy. The renaming of the Pacific Command to the Indo-Pacific Command indicates that Southeast Asia and the South China Sea have become downgraded in a broader security strategy that pays more attention not just to our Northeast Asian commitments, but also to our growing Indian Ocean challenges. The view was, in renaming to Indo-Pacific Command, that the United States needed to start thinking seriously about how to prioritize different security challenges in the Indo-Pacific region. With China's rise, given that China is a nuclear power and a Security Council member and a major great power rival, the United States needed to decide which stakes or which challenges were small stakes and which stakes or which challenges were big stakes. And in that transformation, the South China Sea is now seen as a small stakes challenge for the United States. Of course, one might note that at the end of 2018, President Trump signed the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, which was intended to reassure our Asian allies that our commitments to Asia remain strong, that the renaming of the command from the Pacific Command to the Indo-Pacific Command did not represent a downgrading. However, when we look at the contents of the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act so far, in terms of what has been done under the guise of the ARIA, the main focus has been disarmament in North Korea, support for Taiwan and its growing vulnerability to China, and a focus on counterterrorism in Southeast Asia. South China Sea has not been a major priority of the ARIA, and I would argue that that's consistent with a slow trend in U.S. security strategy in which South China Sea has become downgraded. The issue then for ASEAN nations is, having enjoyed the benefits of China's economic expansion and not wanting to jeopardize their market access to China or their investment from China, the withdrawal of U.S. security coverage for the region presents them with a dilemma. For the first time, perhaps in 20 years, ASEAN has to face the fact that there is no free lunch when it comes to security issues. So let's understand what China is doing. China is in the midst of a long-term transformation intended to reclaim its historical role as the dominant power in East Asia. Xi Jinping's China dream is merely an attempt to make obvious what was clear in earlier strategic statements by China about its peaceful rise in Asia. And I think what's important to remember about China's grand strategy is it is primarily intended to establish a zone of primacy in its near abroad, to establish security for a great power, which means the denial of security threats from other great powers in its near abroad, mainly the East China Sea and the South China Sea. It's a picture of the Liaoning aircraft carrier, which was the old Ukrainian half-built aircraft carrier that they towed to Macau, and they were going to turn into a casino. That's what they said. Actually, they were going to build an aircraft carrier, which they did, and that's a picture of the Liaoning steaming into Hong Kong harbor with a container ship on the way out. And if you want to know whether it's all about the container ships, I would say it's not. China is mainly concerned with security and grand strategy in South China Sea. So to the extent that it is undertaking economic activities, whether oil exploration or fishing in disputed areas, the intention is not to catch more fish or sell more oil, but to establish Chinese primacy in the South China Sea. China's dredger, the 140-meter Tiankun Ho vessel, is the biggest dredging vessel in the world. And one of the things it's been doing is building small islands throughout the South China Sea and putting airstrips on them, and thereby changing the facts on the ground in the South China Sea. So these are the three main air bases that China has built in the last 5 years. Fiery Cross Reef is the one on the bottom there. Mischief Reef, aptly named, is the one on the left, and Subi Reef is on the right. Those are all now operational air bases of the People's Liberation Army Air Force and supplied by Naval, Coast Guard, and Maritime Militia ships. These images, by the way, were released intentionally by the United States in order to draw attention to China's expansion in the South China Sea. And yet, even as China has been building these islands, it has been negotiating with ASEAN on whether or not countries in the South China Sea should be able to build islands and militarize them. It's pretty much the definition of bad faith negotiation. The Tiankunho dredger, 140 meters long, can dredge up the equivalent of 80 large freight containers of sand every hour. And that's how it's building these islands so rapidly. China has also made a point of opening up scheduled commercial airline flights to the Fiery Cross Reef landing strip. The purpose of that is to show that this is China's domestic territory, because these are classified as domestic flights. So both China Southern Airlines and Hainan Airlines now run regularly scheduled flights with nobody on board to Fiery Cross Reef. So the facts on the ground have changed. ASEAN seems to have been negotiating in good faith with China. China has not been negotiating in good faith with ASEAN. Indeed, China's intention is to continue negotiating until it has established facts on the ground that give it military primacy in the South China Sea, which I would say it has pretty much achieved already. So what does this mean about thinking about the variety of responses to China's expansion? So I think it's important to actually widen the lens from beyond ASEAN to think of all Asia, Indo-Pacific countries, and their different attitudes and stances towards China's expansion. So this is just an attempt to rank countries according to the degree to which they are more active in deterring China's expansion or less active in deterring China's expansion. I've had a lot of debates with my colleagues on this ranking. Everybody has a different ranking. It's a great debate. I'm not sure this is the right ranking, but I think it's important to think about the ways that different countries have different stances towards China's expansion. I put Taiwan at the top not because Taiwan is necessarily deterring China in the South China Sea, mainly because Taiwan faces an imminent existential threat from China and therefore has the most robust preparations for deterring Chinese aggression against itself. Pacific Islands recognizing Taiwan, although they don't make the news, are vitally important to the deterrence of China in the Indo-Pacific region. The reason being that if China were able to establish naval bases in the Pacific Islands, it would create a grave security threat to the region by forcing the United States Pacific Fleet in particular to divide its attention between two different spheres of influence. And in the case of a conflict, that would be a very large vulnerability for the US Navy. Japan and Australia and South Korea, of course, are treaty allies of the United States on security issues. Vietnam maybe is a little too high here, but I do believe that Vietnam is rising in its willingness to deter Chinese expansion in Southeast Asia. Of course, the USS Carl Vinson aircraft carrier visited Vietnam last year, the first time an aircraft carrier had docked in Vietnam since the Vietnam War. And Vietnam participated in the Rim of the Pacific maritime military exercises in Hawaii last year for the first time, along with, among the Southeast Asian nations, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand. And the US has now lifted its ban on arms sales to Vietnam, lethal arms sales, which means that Vietnam, I think, is rising very rapidly on the ranking of countries actively deterring China. There are other initiatives taking place. I think India, in its inclusion in the Indo-Pacific quadrilateral cooperation, is getting more serious about the role it needs to play in Indo-Pacific security. Indonesia has taken some steps to be more active It has reinforced its runway facilities on Natuna Island and asserted an exclusive economic zone around that island, which the US has supported. And further down the list, Singapore, Thailand, Burma, Cambodia are in my view, various states of denial about the China threat to this region and to the South China Sea. Meanwhile, the Pacific Islands, who recognize China, are an imminent threat to regional security, in particular Cook Island and the Marshall Islands, which the Chinese would like to turn into a PLA naval base. So you have a variety of responses in the region, and I think it's important to think about these responses in terms of what might be coming down the pipeline from China. Perhaps the reason why there's been a variety of responses within ASEAN is there's a variety of views about the extent to which China represents a threat to the region. Indeed, I think it's probably fair to say that ASEAN does not see China as a threat. ASEAN mostly sees China as a challenge. One thing that might change the calculations of ASEAN beyond simply island building is a major incident involving PLA Navy and US ASEAN cooperation in the region. This will, for example, come to a head in 2022 when the current Party General Secretary Xi Jinping, who is also the president, would normally have stepped down after 10 years in power. As you may know, Xi Jinping amended the Constitution 2 years ago and removed the term limit on the presidential position, presumably with the intention of remaining in power as a kind of leader for life. The problem is that change faces significant internal dissent in China. There's a large movement among political elites to force him to stand down. And as that 2022 leadership succession approaches, China will be in a classic situation of a potential diversionary conflict. Diversionary conflict meaning when political instability forces ambitious leaders to try to burnish their assets in the domestic political competition through some external aggression. Vietnam and US have long-term planning for maritime exercises. There is a maritime exercise planned for 2022 between the US and Vietnam. This is just thinking up scenarios. I have no reason to think there's any intention right now to disrupt that, but the timing will be perfect for a diversionary conflict. And I don't mean China trying to stop the exercises, but some harassment, some interdiction, some unintentional incident that causes ASEAN to wake up to China's growing view that the South China Sea is part of China's domestic territory. So let's think about the ASEAN response. We've been asking or hearing people ask for ASEAN to have a united strategy on China for 30 years now. And let me break the news to you, it's never going to happen. ASEAN has too many internal weaknesses to ever have a united strategy on any security matter, much less security matter of China. The interests, ideas, and identities of ASEAN states diverge widely. Most ASEAN states, with a few exceptions, are weak and face significant internal challenges. There are intra-ASEAN security tensions. You can't be a collective security partner with a country that you have unresolved security issues with. And finally, the doctrines and strategies that ASEAN countries have adopted towards China are divergent and unlikely to converge anytime soon. So the result of that is there is probably a problem of what we would call underbalancing by ASEAN. So balancing means taking steps to deter a rising power from using that power to expand its territorial interests. If ASEAN had completely underbalanced and done nothing to respond to China's expansion, then we would get a divide and rule strategy by China, which perhaps is closer to the end of the spectrum where we are right now. ASEAN has engaged in underbalancing, largely relying on the United States to try to maintain balancing against China in the region through things such as freedom of navigation operations. The problem with underbalancing is, in the context of a withdrawal of the United States from this region, or a downgrading of South China Sea as a security priority for the United States, underbalancing leads to divide and rule by China. The facts on the ground become established security structures, and the South China Sea becomes a part of China. Now, the alternative at the other end would be perhaps overbalancing. At least, I think in the view of ASEAN countries, a unified strategy towards China, even a formalized collective security arrangement in the region, would be seen by most ASEAN countries as overbalancing, perhaps encouraging a more aggressive China by excessive deterrence. So what we have right now in ASEAN, perhaps moving towards this middle area, what I would call current balancing, is a form of distributed deterrence by ASEAN countries, in which ASEAN countries have, in effect, offered mutual support to ASEAN member nations for their individual deterrence initiatives, both within and outside of the region. I call this current, not necessarily optimal, because I'm not sure what is the optimal degree of balancing by ASEAN. I think it's probably true that underbalancing is not optimal. We will see in the next 10 years, as the US security strategy and priorities reduce the attachment to South China Sea, whether this is optimal. But what do we mean by some of these individual deterrence initiatives? Well, for example, ASEAN countries continue to maintain ties with the United States in various bilateral and multilateral contexts. For instance, Malaysia has conducted in the past year the Kara Strike Serial training, one of several initiatives that Malaysia has with the United States. We can give lots of examples of bilateral cooperation between ASEAN countries and the United States. And the importance of these initiatives is that it signals to China that ASEAN rejects China's primacy in the region, that ASEAN nations believe that the security of Southeast Asia and the South China Sea requires a continued commitment from the United States. The other type of distributed deterrence that ASEAN countries can and have undertaken is distributed deterrence between ASEAN countries and non-ASEAN countries in the Indo-Pacific region. As I say, there's growing cooperation between ASEAN countries and India. ASEAN countries also maintain growing and close ties, sometimes only through the Pacific Rim Initiative, but in other ways with Northeast Asian countries, South Korea, Japan in particular. And I actually believe that ASEAN cooperation with Taiwan is a critical and underappreciated form of distributed deterrence between ASEAN countries and non-ASEAN countries with respect to China. Why is that? Because in many ways, Taiwan is a litmus test for the ability of Asia to resist China's territorial expansion. Taiwan is a sovereign and independent country. The United States does not consider Taiwan a province of China. It simply takes note that China considers Taiwan a province of China. And ASEAN's response to the Taiwan issue is important, not just as a litmus test of ASEAN's willingness to deter China, but in a more concrete way. The more that ASEAN signals to China its permissiveness towards China on the Taiwan issue, the more that it draws US resources away from South China Sea towards Taiwan. If Taiwan only has the United States to support it and not Southeast Asia, then Southeast Asia will have less US resources and commitment from the United States. Again, there's no free lunch. This is an example actually of a Singapore Air Force fighter, cargo plane in Taiwan after the typhoon there. Singapore actually has resisted China's attempts to prohibit it from having joint military training with Taiwanese forces. Singapore sends its army for training every year in Taiwan. They have to ship some of their equipment through Hong Kong, and China has occasionally tried to apprehend those shipments, but Singaporeans, to their credit, have continued the cooperation, and that's a good model, I think, for the rest of the ASEAN nations in their attitude towards Taiwan. Attitudes towards Taiwan by ASEAN matters for ASEAN's own security. So I say, have a nice flight. Have a nice flight, ASEAN. Enjoy dealing with China without a major US presence. This is China Southern Airlines flight landing at Fiery Cross Reef last year. Again, the purpose of these flights is to establish that the South China Sea is part of China's domestic territory. So this is, I might say, to borrow a phrase from Newt Gingrich way back in the 1990s, this is a time for choosing for ASEAN. ASEAN has not chosen to create a unified collective security response to China in the South China Sea or in Southeast Asia. Nor has ASEAN chosen to concede the South China Sea and Southeast Asian security to China. But that ability to decline a unified collective security strategy and not to concede to Chinese aggression has always depended on the US giving high priority to this region by providing, in effect, a free public good, and that free public good is now ending. If ASEAN continues with business as usual, the result will be China's control of this South China Sea area, and more broadly, its primacy in the Southeast Asian area. So what will ASEAN choose? Have a nice flight. Thank you.